new FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, that is, by the Billy Love Express. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're speaking with Glenn Greenwald, the columnist for The Guardian newspaper. I'm Amy Goodman. As news emerged of Edward Snowden's departure from Hong Kong, Senator Dianne Feinstein, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, appeared on Face the Nation. She talked about what might have facilitated Edward Snowden's departure.
I had actually thought that China would see this as an opportunity to improve relations and extradite him to the United States. China clearly had a role in this, in my view. I don't think this was just Hong Kong without Chinese acquiescence. I think his choice of Moscow was interesting. I think what's interesting is that he was taken off in a car and his luggage in a separate car. I think it'll be very interesting to see what Moscow does with him. Thirdly, he clearly was aided and abetted, possibly by the WikiLeaks organization. I heard a rumor that he was traveling with someone, and so this had to have been all pre-planned. Now, what the destination is, no one really knows. But I think from the point of view of our committee, something that concerns me more is that we get an understanding in this nation that what this is all about is the nation's security.
Senator Feinstein also said she had seen no evidence of abuse by the National Security Agency, instead pointed a finger at China's surveillance practices.
I have seen no abuse by these agencies, nor has any claim ever been made in any way, shape, or form that this was abused. You know, it's interesting to me because, I mean, I've been going to China for 34 years now, trying to increase relationships between our two countries. There is no question about China's prowess in this arena. There is no question about their attempts to get into our national defense networks, as well as major private businesses.
That was Senator Feinstein on Face the Nation. Glenn Greenwald, your response to some of her points.
Well, first of all, Dianne Feinstein is outright lying when she says that she doesn't know of any instances of abuse at the National Security Agency, leaving aside the fact that there have been several different reports by ABC News, by the New York Times, of the NSA abusing its eavesdropping powers over the last 4 years. There is a 2011 opinion, 80 pages long, from the FISA court, the secret court that oversees the NSA. And what it ruled, although the opinion is top secret and hasn't been publicly released, what it ruled is that the way in which the NSA is spying on American citizens is in violation of the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution, as well as in excess of the limitations imposed by the statute, the FISA Amendments Act of 2008. In other words, what the NSA is doing is both unconstitutional and illegal. And so, although the public doesn't have access to that opinion, shockingly, that in a democracy you could have a court rule the government has violated the law and the Constitution and keep it all a secret, Dianne Feinstein has access to that opinion. And so when she says into the camera that there's no evidence that she's aware of that the NSA has abused its spying powers, she's simply lying because she knows that the claim she's making is false. Secondly, as far as the outrage that she expressed, that Obama officials routinely express over the fact that China is hacking into our military installations and the like, she's right, they are doing that. But one of the things that these documents exposed, and that Mr. Snowden exposed to China, is that the United States is not only hacking into China's military systems, but also its civilian systems. And part of the reason why the Chinese government was unable to turn Snowden over to the U.S., even had they wanted to, was because public opinion in China and in Hong Kong was so enraged by that revelation that their text messages are being directed into NSA repositories that they simply couldn't, consistent with public opinion, hand Snowden over to the United States.
What about this latest news, Glenn Greenwald, about the South China Morning Post revelations of Snowden about how the U.S. hacked China's mobile phone companies and 2 universities?
Right. I mean, I think the reason why Snowden made those revelations is extremely obvious, which is that he was in Hong Kong and needed to protect himself from being turned over to the U.S., where he would spend the rest of his life in prison. And so he stepped forward to say that his government has been lying to the world when it pretends that only China, but not it, the U.S. government, hacks into civilian infrastructure. It was an act of self-preservation. It was also a way of exposing the deceit and hypocrisy of top-level political officials in the United States who have tricked their own public into believing that China, but not the United States, does these sorts of things.
Is this espionage?
Espionage is when you work for and at the behest of a foreign government to steal secrets. There's zero evidence he did that. Or when you covertly pass secrets to an adversary government. He never did that. Or when you sell secrets to another country, which he could have done for millions of dollars to enrich himself, and yet never did. It is not espionage in any sense of the word. And of course, the irony here is that the ones who are engaged in massive spying is the U.S. government. Mr. Snowden essentially refused to engage in spying, and now they're accusing him of espionage.
Finally, Glenn, I want to play a clip of your interview when you were on Meet the Press with David Gregory yesterday.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call themselves a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies. The assumption in your question, David, is completely without evidence, the idea that I've aided and abetted him in any way. The scandal that arose in Washington before our stories began was about the fact that the Obama administration is trying to criminalize investigative journalism by going through the emails and phone records of AP reporters, accusing a Fox News journalist of the theory that you just embraced, being a co-conspirator with felonies for working with sources. If you want to embrace that theory, it means that every investigative journalist in the United States who works with their sources, who receives classified information, is a criminal. And it's precisely those theories and precisely that climate that has become so menacing in the United States. It's why the New Yorker's Jane Mayer said investigative reporting has come to a standstill, her word, as a result of the theories that you just referenced.
Well, the question of who's a journalist may be up to a debate with regard to what you're doing. And of course, anybody who's watching this understands I was asking a question. That question has been raised by lawmakers as well. I'm not embracing anything, but obviously I take your point.
That is David Gregory, the host of Meet the Press. Glenn Greenwald, would you like to carry this conversation forward? Of course, it's been raised over and over. Peter King, the congressman from New York, calling for you to be prosecuted.
Right, and actually Andrew Ross Sorkin, the extremely Wall Street-friendly New York Times quote-unquote reporter who covers Wall Street, apparently went on CNBC this morning and essentially speculated or suggested that I ought to be arrested as well. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know of anybody who has a lower opinion of the Beltway media generally, of David Gregory specifically, for that matter, Andrew Ross Sorkin specifically, than I do, and yet it actually is even surprising to me to watch them openly do the dirty work of the U.S. government in essentially suggesting publicly that journalists who report on what the government is doing ought to be turned into criminals. You know, one of the main criticisms that I've voiced about the Beltway media is that they're not adversarial to the government at all, but actually that they are servants of the government, mouthpieces for it. Lots of other people have made that critique, including you, Amy, and I think it's almost like Christmas for those of us who believe that, to watch this gift being handed to us that so vividly proves it, that rather than defend what is supposed to be their right that they are supposed to safeguard, which is freedom of the press, they're leading the chorus against other journalists on behalf of the government that they serve, demanding essentially and theorizing that we're guilty of crimes for doing what journalists are supposed to do, which is shining a light on what political officials are doing in the dark.
Glenn, McClatchy had an interesting piece. Obama's crackdown views leaks as aiding enemies of the U.S., talking about President Obama's unprecedented initiative known as the Insider Threat Program. Can you explain what that is?
The Insider Threat Program is a program implemented by the Obama administration that is very consistent with their overall unprecedented attack on leakers and whistleblowers. That is even what the New York Times this morning called it, an unprecedented attack on leaks, in which government employees are encouraged, in fact required, to report to authorities any other government employees that they even suspect might be thinking about leaking. And what makes it so pernicious is that it defines people who leak as being enemies of the state. So if any government employee sees wrongdoing and brings that wrongdoing to light, then if that wrongdoing was conducted behind a wall of secrecy by having it be called classified or anything else, they are deemed by the U.S. government to be essentially enemies of the state. That's the term that this program uses for them. And this is the vital context for everything that is happening with Mr. Snowden, for WikiLeaks, for this entire story, which is that the reason why we need Ed Snowden's, the reason why he came forward in the way that he did, and the reason why he felt he had to flee the United States is precisely because there are no people in the United States more persecuted at the moment than those who bring transparency to what the U.S. government is doing. They are treated as enemies of the state. They are called traitors, as John Kerry called Mr. Snowden today. And that's the reason that investigative journalism is being so threatened by the policies of the Obama administration. I hope all of your viewers will go to Google and type McClatchy, Obama, and leaks and read that McClatchy report on what the Obama administration is doing to wage a war on transparency like no other president has ever done.
Glenn, do you have more documents leaked by Edward Snowden that you're going to be writing about, more exposés in the coming days?
Definitely. I mean, we're going to take our time in reporting it. We're going to make sure that everything we report is accurate and the picture is complete. But my only priority at the moment is going through these documents, vetting them, and continuing to report on them. And there are lots of other stories coming.
Glenn Greenwald, I want to thank you for being with us, columnist and blogger for The Guardian, also a constitutional lawyer, speaking to us from his home in Brazil. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we're going to be joined by the lawyer for Julian Assange, Michael Ratner, President Emeritus of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Again, the latest news we have, it was reported that Edward Snowden left Hong Kong and went to Russia, and that he was then going to Cuba. But journalists on the plane he was supposedly going to be on say his seat was empty. That's what we know at this point. We also have been monitoring a news conference that's been held by the Ecuadorian foreign minister in Vietnam, saying that they have received a letter from Edward Snowden to the president of Ecuador, President Correa, appealing for political asylum. We'll be back with Michael Ratner in a moment.